So Rion resurrected the idea about 9 or 10 years later, and council thought it was a good idea. It would be a good project to undertake at 30 years and the 30th anniversary of WAS. So we got going, or Rion got going, and then in 2020, the other editors became involved. And the question then is, what did you do during lockdown? So this is the motley crew of editors, with Julian Hughes on the right, then Bob Haycock to his left, Anne Brenchley, my wife, in the middle, Rion, and then me over to the left-hand side. So all the editors at that time were members of council of the Welsh Ornithological Society, and 2 of us were directors of LRCs. That's just incidental, not important to the project. Okay, so the first 2 meetings of editors were in January and February 2020, and the year seemed to start off fairly normally, and 4 of us live in North Wales, so we met at Pensachnant, which is a conservation centre in Conwy. Well worth a visit if you ever come up north. But then lockdown started on the 23rd of March. All the self-isolation stuff became mandatory for us lesser mortals, maybe not quite the same down in London, but there we go. So no face-to-face meetings. What do we do? And of course, that's when we got introduced to Zoom. So when we started, 4 of us lived up in North Wales. Pensachnant is shown with a star, and Bob Haycock lived down in Pembrokeshire. And John Green, who did Rare Birds, he lives somewhere here north of Cardigan. And so this is to show that we did actually use Zoom, and we spent many a happy hour looking at each other on it. Okay, so in terms of writing the book, there are about 450 species to be dealt with. So we decided that we'd split the book into 5 sections, not exactly equal in length, but meant to be approximately so. And we editors volunteered to write certain accounts, or we suggested authors with special knowledge of species, like, for example, Adrian Stratford for chough and so on. Oh gosh, I've forgotten his name. No, never mind. So at first, each editor was given a section in which to do all the primary editorial work when accounts were finished. But at that stage, I was relieved of that job. I'm not quite sure whether they thought I wasn't up to it or whatever, but anyway, I was asked to prepare all the maps and charts. And so I think there were about 600 that I dealt with initially. And some of them had to be dealt with several times because of various changes. So the charts were prepared in Excel, which generally worked fine. And the maps I prepared either in DMAP, which is a program I've been using for about 30 years, or QGIS, which is something I've been introduced to relatively recently, but found very helpful. One of the key reasons for that is QGIS has layers for the distribution of data, whereas unfortunately DMAP doesn't. And although I've asked Alan Morton to change that, as he's in his 70s, I don't think he's over keen to do the programming. Rare species accounts were prepared by John Green and Rob Sandham, and we got a photo editor of Ben Porter, who himself takes some wonderful photos that you may have seen from his time on Bardsey. Well, in undertaking the job, I haven't got photographs of us sitting at desks and slaving away with piles of books beside us. So you have to kind of take that as read. That did happen in each of our houses. But this is the book we were trying to follow. And this was written in the 1990s. And my goodness, things have changed since then. And so we were enormously lucky. And I don't know how Lovegrove Williams and Williams did theirs, although of course they were RSPB staff members. So we were able, because of the internet, we were able to draw a breeding bird survey. So that's for willow warbler. Webs, that's the chart for water rail. Then we were able to get records from Stockholm and Bardsey. So that chart there is the combined data for weekly counts for chiff-chaff. Then there are the other charts about from bird report records, and this is for yellow wagtail breeding pairs. The Welsh Rare Birds Committee and its predecessor, the Welsh Rarities Advisory Group and Welsh Records Panel, they've been gathering records, and this is the number of records that have occurred for corncrake over the last 30 or so years. No, more than 30 years, I beg your pardon. For the rare birds, it's since we had the first proper records. And then there were some BTO ringing records. In this case, this map is of grey wagtail recoveries, where red circles are birds that were ringed in Wales and found outside Wales. Blue triangles are birds that were ringed outside Wales but found in Wales. And the little dots in Wales are the places where the birds either came from or went to. So there were plenty of other sources. There was Birds in Wales itself. Then there was the supplement that John Green prepared in 2002. The national BTO atlases and several tetrad atlases that have been published in Wales. They were extremely useful. County avifaunas, county bird reports, then in the north, particularly forest, 1907 and 1919, and the equivalents for South Wales, which are mainly Ingram and salmon, or they're usually involved with them. And then various papers, and many came from bird study and or Welsh birds, as later called Birds in Wales. So there was an awful lot to go through, and as I say, I had my study 2 extra tables covered with books. So the process was that each author was expected to draft an account following a pattern that Creon had prepared and that we had agreed to. Then when we drafted that account, we then put it in Dropbox. Now, Dropbox, I must admit, was a huge asset for us, and it would have been very difficult without it. But we put our accounts in Dropbox, and then the other editors, as and when they had time, could look at them and add comments, amend, and whatever. I've just been asked to start video. I'm sorry about that. Then the original author would go back to their draft and review all the comments and whatever had been added to the text and do their best to make sense of it, redraft and whatever, and then put it back into the Dropbox folder so that if there were any further comments, they would be needed. Then at a later stage, the section editor would take each draft account in their section and they would deal with any outstanding issues and try to get the account into a relatively polished account, which could then be sent out for checking. Now, during all this drafting stages, we were starting to see the need for a house style document because there are consistency issues about how we were going to spell certain things, how we were going to refer to certain things. And this house style document expanded. And in the end, it was 12 A4 pages. We're hoping the house style document will remain useful for the editors of the journal Birds in Wales so that it's not just kind of lost. But yeah, it was quite interesting. Once we had a 12-page house style document, we then had to make sure that each of our accounts followed the house style, which was an interesting test of our mental agility. So when a section had been fully edited and corrected, that whole section was sent to a volunteer who was sometimes a bird recorder, but certainly a person who was used to bird recording, in order to check it. And this was to check that it made sense, there were no important records missing, or if there was anything written there that was seemed to be nonsense to point that out. Once they had commented, it came back, and then the suggested changes were dealt with by the section editor. So when the section was thought to be in a finally completed state, each completed section was then sent to a proofreader. In fact, a friend of mine up here who I used to work with, who's a non-bird specialist, but certainly bird interested. And he was looking to make sure that all of the writing and all the corrections meant that it was actually still in English that was as good as it could be. So all of this went on during the remaining part of 2020, during lockdown. And without lockdown, it's difficult to imagine how the job would have got done, to be honest. So lockdown was a bit of a blessing. I know some people were cursing lockdown because they were stuck at home with nothing to do. That was so far from the case for us, and we were very lucky, really. Now, this isn't necessarily about writing it, but it's one of the things that came out of it that I think is worth sharing. Wales is about 9% of the land area of Britain. And yet, with our breeding species, this shows the percentage of the UK population that occur in Wales. So you can see that for chough, hawfinch, and pied flycatcher and so on, we have an enormous responsibility for those species because most of the British population is actually within our borders. And I mean, even nuthatch, we've got 24% of the population in Wales. Oops. That's gone back. Where is that? For wintering species, likewise, I don't know about the percentage of coastline that we've got, but in terms of wintering species, in Wales has 94% of the UK population of chough, down to 19% of the wintering population of guillemot. And despite the lack of numbers, we've still got 20% of the UK population of willowtit occurring in Wales, which is amazing. So it certainly the work that we did turned out some very interesting information. Now, in terms of the publication, early in the project, we decided that we would approach Liverpool University Press. And the reason for that was that Anne, Creon and myself had been involved with the publication of the Breeding Birds of North Wales, or Adar Nathi Gogledd Cymru. And Liverpool University Press published that for us. And so we got to know Liverpool University Press. We felt happy with them, and they seemed to feel fairly comfortable with us as well. So the original contract was that we would have 448 pages as the Breeding Birds of North Wales. And in order to get that published, we would have to pay about £17,000, which is approximately half of the expected publication cost, with LUP stumping up the other half. But during the year, we realized that with the volume of material that we had, there was no way we were going to manage to cram the information we had into 448 pages. And we wanted to have a reasonable number of photographs to make the book attractive for anybody who is just looking through it, if nothing else. So we knew that we needed extra pages. The cost was £2,000 for every 32 pages. And in the end, we were asked we increased the amount we had to pay to £32,000. Now, WAS is not an organisation that is overflowing with money. So the question was, how on earth would we raise this money? So I argued that we should do like we did for the Breeding Birds of North Wales and seek sponsorship. And at that time, I must admit, I did forget that the Atlas was a mass participation project, whereas writing the Birds of Wales is very far from that. But thankfully, the birders in Wales really liked the idea. And thankfully, despite the skepticism of the treasurer, we managed to raise just over £32,000 in sponsorship. And two major chunks of that came from Lurk Wales, for which we're very grateful, and also National Resources Wales. And that was to some extent unexpected, but very, very welcome. So again, some of the things we found out about birds in Wales were, if you look at the top of the screen, unfortunately, there were certain species that have stopped breeding in Wales. And you can see the time periods at the very top, in the top banner there. Before 1875, for example, crane, bittern and goshawk had all disappeared. And then in the last 20 or 30 years, no, 50 years, turtle dove, corncrake, woodlark, nightingale and corn bunting have gone. Although corn bunting might just be coming back on the Shropshire border at Bettisfield, but it's not certain yet. And then, I'm sorry about that. And then there are some species that have come back to breed in Wales despite having disappeared earlier. So we've got bittern, and goshawk, marsh harrier, and then bittern again. So there have been lots of losses, but there have been a few species that have come back, and that's encouraging. Okay, we then have a whole load of Word files, Excel files, and PDFs of maps. And the crucial bit then is to put it all together to do the typesetting or designing of the book. And we had a young lady up in Lancaster who did that for us. And our proofs had to be handed in by the 1st of November. And thankfully, we managed to get ourselves sorted so that everything was proofread by the English, if you like, proofreader once. And we got all our files in on time. We then sat back for a few months while the young lady got on with our work. And then during the early months of 2021, the first proof we got back, we found that there were some problems with some of the data for rare species, which we had to deal with. And that was a major bit of extra work. But then we had 3 other proof stages, and gradually we whittled it down so that there was nothing else that we felt that we needed to change. And it went for printing, and it was published in July 2021. There are only a couple of stupid little things that we've noticed that are there that we would prefer not to have been there. But so far as we're aware, we only know of good reviews of the book. And we're certainly grateful for that. So in terms of numbers, the work was done over 719 days because Freon had started in 2019. 52 authors contributed, 44 photographers, 1 artist, Philip Snow, he did the back and front covers. 28 people were checkers and 76 people were consulted about various issues, and 105 people sponsored species. So there were 451 species, 34 subspecies, 4 either-ors. The ones that come to mind are Xeno and Fears petrel. I can't remember what the others are. And there are 115 species that were escapes or whatever that are in an appendix at the back. So it weighs 2.8 kilograms, and it's not a book you want to take out with you particularly. Some people have suggested it could act as a coffee table, never mind be a coffee table book. It ended up as 580 something pages, just short of 500,000 words, just short of 1,600 references, and the cover price is £45. although you can get it cheaper than that because LUP are offering discounts, and worth looking at their websites. So this is one good review we had from the BTO, and we're very grateful for that. And yeah, Welsh-based birders and ornithologists should not be without a copy. Well, I would certainly say that, but of course I would anyway, wouldn't I? So I would like to thank all the birders, ringers, surveyors, and whoever across Wales whose data were used in the book, because without their contributions, we wouldn't have had anything to say, really. We'd like to certainly thank all those people who contributed directly to the production of the book. I thank Julian Hughes for letting me use some slides from a talk he prepared. Those were all the colourful ones. And to Shubrek for the invitation to this forum. Very many thanks to you all.